Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to yet another pleasant Friday afternoon panel discussion. And of course, I would call it a CISO panel discussion because this is part of the CISO forum stream of the Cyber Exchange Online Summit. And today is day 2, and it has been a really exciting journey so far. Really good speakers, really good discussions, and a highly engaging audience. We are going to be talking today about a really interesting subject, and of course, a subject which hits close to home to many CISOs and many security leaders. And the title of today's session is Lessons Learned from Recent Breaches in Canada. And of course, before I talk about the session, I think I'll just let all the speakers introduce themselves, just a quick introduction. I think, but I would like to start off by saying that we have a star-studded CISO panel. I'm really fortunate to have them all here today. So I would like to start off with the person right next door to me, Mr. Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Ward. I'm a senior solution architect with Guardicore. I deal with a lot of CISOs and very large organizations.
Good. Zaki.
Hi there, I'm Zaki Abbas. I'm the VP and CISO of Brookfield Asset Management.
Thank you, Zaki. Michael.
Michael Ball, and I'm founder of Team CISO and Breach the Keep. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but we look after small business cybersecurity.
Thank you, Michael. And Michael Ball has a significantly large fan following, so hello to all Michael Ball fans. Okay, the next one, and thank you, Michael. The next one is Jaron.
Jaron Specterman, CISO and owner of Access 3G Consulting. Has over 20 years experience in the cyber world.
Thank you, Ron. So let's get this started, guys. So as CISO, breaches is something which and security events are things which keep us on our toes. And of course, we learned a lot from those incidents and from all these things. And of course, the current threat landscape is now changing on a daily basis. And of course, COVID-19 has changed the equation. The attack vectors are evolving. The attacks are changing. The state actors and the non-state actors are stepping up the game. But of course, in my opinion, I think from the Canadian threat landscape perspective, 2019 and 18 were a tipping point for us. And the reason for that is that in 2018 and 19, Canadians got to experience some really large breaches. One of the things that we will be ensuring today is that we're not going to be naming the companies who were breached, but we will talk about what are the key lessons learned from them. And one of the things that I've often heard many security experts saying is that never judge an organization on the breach, judge them on how they respond to a breach. And that's what matters the most. Because I mean, they often say is that there are organizations who are breached, and then there are organizations who don't know about it. So any organization at any point in time has been a victim of a breach, could be small, could be large, but they have been a victim to it. And I think that's something which we should all understand. So in the past 10 to 12 months, we as Canadians have seen a breach at a large telco. We saw a breach at a large financial services organization. We also saw a recent breach at a health diagnostics company also. So of course, these are breaches which have happened at various segments in the private and of course, just the private sector. And of course, we'll see that in the public sector, we saw some breaches and we saw some ransomware attacks. So the purpose of today's discussion is to hear the perspective of the security leaders and CISOs in terms of what lessons have they learned and what is their perspective and what would they recommend to other security leaders in terms of how to be well prepared to respond to these breaches or perhaps to even prevent these breaches. Because I think as security leaders, we all want to have a more proactive approach towards breaches rather than having a reactive approach, because the reactive approach is more painful. It's more painful for all the stakeholders. It costs lots and lots of money. And of course, the reputational damage comes along with it. So without further ado, let's get the discussion started. And of course, the first thing that I would want the panelists to weigh in on is security hygiene. And of course, one of the things that we have seen or noticed in these recent breaches is that when there was a root cause analysis done, it was found that, for instance, there was a weak admin password, or perhaps they didn't apply the last patch, or there was some weakness on the security hygiene front. So I would like to pose my question to Michael Ball first, that what is your perspective, Michael, on the state of cybersecurity hygiene, and what could organizations do in terms of having better security hygiene in their organization?
Sure. So I'm going to take this in a little different direction than my friends may. I'm going to talk about security hygiene specifically around cloud services, because that's where a lot of the breaches are currently happening, and that's where the visibility is. So cloud architecture is not your grandfather's data center architecture. And most large enterprises are going in and building cloud architecture like they would have their data centers, so sort of a lift and shift thing. And from a hygiene perspective, that doesn't work. The available architecture to us, or the tooling and everything that's available, is different. We need our architects to relearn the new methodologies of cloud, and don't make the assumptions that our cloud provider are going to imply security on top of it. It's still our business.
Okay, thanks. That's a fair point. And of course, Jaron, how would you weigh in on this, on the aspect of security hygiene?
Well, I do think that nowadays there is organizations are realizing that there are a lot of products out there. They're realizing that not everything is shiny, and that there is no one silver bullet that will block everything. I do think that as organizations are maturing, they are buying more and more tools, but these are working in silos, and they need to realize that. So they need an overarching strategic planning around all their tools, so they can get the most effective solution out of it. I do think that if you don't have good playbooks in case of incidents, and you're not practicing them, then nothing else matters. Because today's the landscape is every 2 minutes there is a breach, which is shocking. But as you know, this is the landscape, and since the majority of the workforce is now working from home, that exposes us to a far greater attack landscape as well.
Okay, thank you, Ron. I think, Ron, you hit the nail on the head when you spoke about having playbooks. And of course, this threat landscape is evolving, and we need to be better prepared for this. So, and this could be a really interesting segue into my next question, which is more about insider threat and data protection. And of course, in some of the recent breaches, it was noted that insider threat became one of the root causes of the breach into the organization. And of course, I think in most of the cases, the insider threat is often ignored or often downplayed or not taken into account. And of course, there are various reasons for that. But I would like to hear, and of course, data protection also comes into play also, because one of the recent breaches was at a health diagnostic lab. And of course, we talk about PHI and of course PII also. And of course, when we talk about PII, it's there are lots of things associated with protecting PII. I mean, protecting credit card holder information, protecting person identifiable information. And of course, we've got legislations at the provincial and federal level which do have connotations to the breach of that information. So I would like to pose the question to Zaki first as to what is your perspective on insider threat and data protection.
Absolutely, thanks, Farouk. So I'm not sure if everyone knows, but Verizon usually puts out a annual data breach investigation report, and recently they put one out also, and identified, contrary to popular belief, most common causes of data breaches are not just shady internal actors, Rather, they're caused by external actors. And specifically, they identified that 70% of attacks are happening by external attackers as compared to 30%, which is due to the insider threat. But that doesn't obviously mean that we should be ignoring insider threats. The risk with insider threats is really that these individuals are already on our network. They already have authorized access to our systems and applications, and as well as data. So it's really difficult to tell if their activities are for legitimate purposes or not. And one of the other quick points from the report was that money or financial motivation is really the root cause of most of these breaches, almost 86%. And obviously, insider threats are different from industry to industry, and it's really important for our security teams to understand the type of data that our organizations hold, where they're located, what needs to be done to secure them, and then also what would the impact of a breach be if that data was stolen as well. So what I usually, when I think of insider threat, I usually categorize it in two categories, one being accidental and one being malicious. And I generally find a lot of it is due to accidents. So accidental usually covers things like individuals that end up clicking on phishing links or opening up attachments that have malware embedded. And both of these activities obviously could potentially lead to breaches, stolen data, ransomware, et cetera, et cetera. But for this type of threat, we generally have security technologies in place to protect the organization. There's things like anti-phishing, anti-malware, web content filtering to detect these kinds of things. On top of that, we generally are doing user security training to help out our staff identify threats and action them accordingly. Now, if we move to the malicious insider threat side of things, on the other hand, really, they're working independently. Sometimes they're also working with other actors to steal information and potentially disrupt our business operations. These individuals are, generally, they have the motivation, they have the capabilities, as well as the privileges really needed to carry out those activities. And it's really difficult to catch these individuals because their activities are very stealthy. And really, there are approaches we can take to protect organizations from, as well as detecting from these types of activities. Things like DLP to identify, if there's lots of data being exfiltrated out, or if there's sensitive data being exfiltrated out. There's obviously other technologies out there to monitor for unauthorized user behavior. As an example, people trying to access sensitive data that's generally not associated with their job function. And then finally, you want to make sure that you've got good physical security in place as well to monitor for odd behavior. So things like people coming in at odd hours when they generally don't come into the organization. And just before I end, I just wanted to jump on the topic around data protection and protecting personal information, specifically or personal data. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important for companies to know where this type of data is, who has access to it, how secure it is, what are some of the retention policies behind it, and then finally, what are some of the regulatory requirements around protecting to the that kind of data. And it really differs from nation to nation, as well as industry to industry.
Okay, good point. Good point. I'd like to flip it over to Jaron now. What's your perspective on cyber threat and data protection?
Well, it's complicated, as they say nowadays. Depends on the organization that you are at, meaning that if you are a global organization, then you need to become in compliance to many of these regulatory constraints. The inside threat nowadays can be an outside threat, and it is dependent on the attack scenario that can evolve quickly. So, for instance, if it is a state-sponsored, then it's a whole different scenario. Yes, internal motivation usually is related to money as a financial gain. We've seen all sorts of breaches the past few years where employees have taken client bases out of the organization without any restrictions. We've seen major leak like WikiLeaks when Snowden has actually pulled out quite a bit of bytes from the NSA. So at the end of the day, as stated before, we need to know what is our valuable data, what are our assets, what do we need to protect, and then figure out what's the best approach to protect it. Is it DLP? Is it behavioral analysis? Or maybe a conjunction between a few of them?
Thank you. I would like to bring in Brian into the conversation. You know, Brian has a really catchy wallpaper on, and of course, he is a security specialist and working for a leading cybersecurity company. So a multifaceted background. But
Yeah,
Brian,
thanks.
how would you weigh in on insider threat? I mean, being on the other side of the fence, being as a service provider and being part of a leading cybersecurity company, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I think what I see when a lot of the customers I talk to and a lot of the CISOs I talk to is that, you know, there's a lack of, you know, following industry standard, you know, acceptable secure configurations in regarding to, you know, what Zaki and Yaron had talked about, especially around DLP and data exfiltration, whether it's done by an external source or an internal source, right? You know, whatever industry you're in, whether it's finance, banking, utilities, you know, there are standards out there that, you know, I think as an organization, you know, need to be followed, right? They give you that framework to kind of protect yourself, you know, against maybe the things that you maybe haven't seen or don't know about, that you can implement pretty easily, you know, and going with, as Yaron said, going with a bunch of, or some different products to protect yourself from that are in the marketplace. There's a lot of help in there, out there, you know, and asking for help, you know, getting that expertise in-house is important also, I think.
Good, thank you. Thanks a lot, Brian. So this takes me to the next talking point, which is also quite essential. The whole world is converging towards the cloud. The whole world is into the business of farming out things. And of course, we all know about the big breach which happened last year on the Amazon cloud. I won't name the financial institution, but we all know who I'm talking about. I think I did a whole podcast with Michael Ball on that last summer. But I think that was a big eye opener for many financial institutions because who have been farming out work or been leveraging the cloud for many things. So I would like to bring in Michael Ball into this conversation. So Michael, what's your take on third-party oversight or third-party risk management? Michael, you're on mute right now.
I'm trying to be nice here and stay on mute. So in Canada, 70% of our gross domestic product is smaller businesses, part of the supply chain. So as an enterprise, you know, we're reliant on these smaller companies to provide us services, products, that sort of thing. However, they don't have the infrastructure or the funding to apply the security controls that a larger enterprise would have. As an enterprise, as a business that relies on these companies, it's our job, our due diligence, to make sure that controls are in place, that when you bring a third party on as a partner, that you have contractual obligations applied to them from security controls, but that we also test those controls and that we apply things like identity management, privilege access management to those third parties. Things, you know, back in the day, you would have a company would join and you would give them one identity that all of their people could log into to provide services to you. Can't do that anymore. If they've got 5 people on their team working for you, you need 5 identities logging into your environment, and you can track and monitor who does what, where, when, how, why.
Yeah, it's a fair comment. And I think the other thing which also I have noticed is the fine print, the contractual obligations. In most of the cases, in the initial days when the business was all about moving to the cloud, and that just speared the whole discussion around shadow IT, because in some cases, the decision to move to the cloud did not involve people from IT. The business said, okay, you know what? I'm moving my entire business information on the Amazon cloud. And hey, who cares about IT? I mean, the reason why I'm moving to the cloud is that I want to just cut the red tape over here. Let's move everything to the cloud. So I think that's one of the things.
I just want to add that, you know, the move to the cloud, organization didn't realize that they still own the data.
Mhm.
So the responsibility of the data is still theirs. And it is quite evident when all these incidents and breaches coming to roll that although you have an SLA, you're still, from regulation perspective, owns the data. So you're liable for it.
Mhm.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, I think there's another point which I would really want Brian to weigh in on. And of course, anybody, if Zaki wants to weigh in, he can do that too. But when I was talking about contractual obligations and the fine print, there are things which relate to lock-in. How can you, if you want to exit from that whole cloud marriage or your relationship, what happens then? So, Brian, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a good example. How do you, so we see that quite a bit where, you know, companies have, you know, ran to the cloud, not read the fine print, discovered that, hey, we're either here too soon, or we're here and we don't like it, it's too expensive. We've kind of lost our controls. We're not used to those controls. How do we get back? How do we get out of this? Or how do we manage it, you know, a little better than they had before? So it's very difficult. You know, it's an arduous process once you make that decision to move to the cloud and start putting resources out there. You know, so I want to say it's really difficult, and I can't say that I've seen a successful retreat from the cloud as of yet.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've yet to hear somebody's story on how they were able to exit from that relationship. I mean, there's
Even
still lots
moving
of
from
talk
provider
about.
to provider is difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Zaki, what's your take on this? I mean, as a CISO, I mean, what has your experience been? I mean, what are the key lessons learned over here?
Really, from a cloud perspective, I mean, and you know, using third parties. Number one, you know, make sure you've got the right types of technologies in place to protect user access. I mean, that's like things like multi-factor authentication has certainly been one area that I think it's the bare minimum you got to start with doing, and make sure that there's proper access controls, access reviews and such. You got to know where your data is, how the cloud providers or third parties can access your data. So I think all those types of things are very important. You got to make sure as well, in terms of third parties, you know, having the right types of contractual provisions in place also is very important.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, data sovereignty is a big issue. I think a lot of Canadian organizations that make the jump to whether it's Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, they don't quite understand that, yeah, the data center is there, but your data is actually maybe transversing the US from BC to Toronto, for instance. So it's an important point to understand, you know, you need a direct link over Canadian sovereign territory, as opposed to going, you know, offloading back or backdooring through the United States.
Can I add to that, Brian?
Yeah.
So one of the discussions that I've had several times is in and around encryption in the data center. So regardless of where the data center is, if your data sits in an American, your data sits in a Canadian data center, make sure that you, as the enterprise, own the encryption keys. If you leave the encryption keys up to the data center provider,
Yes.
When the US government decides that they want to gather that data for whatever reason, the data center provider has an onus to give it to them. If it's encrypted and you manage the keys, then it's not a problem. They can hand the data over and the data center provider's not accountable for decrypting it for them.
Yeah, great point.
Good point.
Assuming that the encryption is strong enough.
Well, you know, that's another problem, right?
That's another question. That's another problem.
Is it ever?
I totally agree with that.
At least give them a challenge. Don't give it to them freely.
Yeah.
Mm.
Exactly. That's a good starting point. So, Brian, I would like to throw it back to you and just talk about lateral movement because in the past few years, there have been lots of attacks and threats which have originated from IoT and OT itself. I think everybody who is attending this session right now is familiar with the Las Vegas fish tank incident. I mean, it just took that one IoT device to which created a backdoor for cyber criminals to get access to customer database. So just talk us through this whole lateral movement.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love lateral movement. I love to talk about lateral movement. It's I see a ton of organizations that are very flat, and you'd be shocked at the size of the organizations that are very flat. They spend a lot of money around the perimeter, around the north-south, but they kind of think it's a castle mentality. If I have very high walls and I have a lot of depth, how are they going to get in? But the cold hard fact is that no matter what you do, someone is going to penetrate that network. Whether it's through an IoT device, whether it's through the weakest link in the chain, which is a human, someone is going to penetrate that. So how do you expand that? How do you stop that lateral movement? And I have, like the fish tank, I have another good story. This is on the same par, but a Canadian company, a mid financial, I won't say who. They had an HVAC management system installed as part of from the facilities team. So the facilities team, obviously responsible for the HVAC systems. Why would they talk to IT, right? Well, I don't have to talk to IT. This is an HVAC system. It's very typical in medium to large corporations where, a lot of people don't want to talk to IT because the IT is sometimes the ministry of no, right? So they want to do it on their own. And that's what happened in this company. So they decided, hey, they wanted a third-party management. And what had happened is they put in an HVAC management IoT device, and the facilities guy plugged it into an empty port on the switch, right? So your first problem there is, why does the switch have an active port on it, right? That it should,
port security,
right? You need your port security on there. So what had happened is obviously that IoT device was compromised. The bad actors gained access. They got into the network. They estimated that they were within the network for over 6 months, scanning, doing, trying to get to, a higher value asset, which in this instance was a lot of PII data. It's unknown exactly how much PII data they exfiltrated with, but they think it was quite a bit. Personal information, credit card information, passwords to the front end website. So really, you look at that and how do you defend against that? It's very difficult, right? So, to prevent that lateral movement, you have to look at, systems that you can put in there to do segmentation, at a level that you can, see visibility for one. You can see how these things are talking. Because if all of a sudden that HVAC system pops up on your network and tries to get into your, digital crown jewel environment, you'll know about it, you'll be aware about it, and you can take action on it. You can follow up. Because I found a lot of organizations, they have a lot of blind spots where they cannot see into the environment, or it's even unknown to them. They think that they, like I said, they have this big castle with these very high walls, and but once you're past that, what do you do? It's very difficult.
So when you talk about castle and very high walls, it brings the breach the keep concept into my mind. So yeah. Michael, do you want to weigh in on this, on lateral movement?
Yes, certainly. So one of the things that I've been fairly successful over the last almost 20 years is privileged ID management. So from the lateral movement, having core assets, the crown jewels, have specifically managed privileged credentials on those, and have the authentication to those crown jewel specific to the asset so that you can track and monitor that. You know, even if you have privileged access on one system, isn't going to give you lateral access on another.
Mhm. Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's talk about another important aspect of breaches is responding to a breach or instant response. And of course, the posture of your instant response and your breach response defines how you're going to recover from it or how well you're prepared for it, or of course talks about how the organization's maturity and instant response. So I'd like to flip it over to Zaki in terms of the importance of instant response when a breach happens or in order to prevent a breach.
Sure, thanks, Farouk. So, you know, having an effective security incident management plan is very critical for any security program. You need to be prepared that systems will get compromised and data may be maliciously stolen or accidentally lost. And we know that not every attack can be really fully prevented. So it's really important that when an incident occurs, firstly, you're able to detect it quickly as possible. And then you're also able to execute your response plan to contain the incident and really recover as quickly as possible also. So an effective plan will really help you mitigate damage as well as really minimize business disruption. You don't want to be in a situation where when an incident occurs, no one knows who's in charge to lead the incident response, how to conduct or how to contact even external specialists that can help with the investigation, who to contact from law enforcement perspective if necessary, who needs to be informed within the organization, who the decision makers are going to be you know, during the incident itself, and who's going to be communicating internally as well as externally. So hence, that's really the reason why all these items need to be documented in a plan. And really, from my perspective, some of the key recommendations just based on my experience is that, number one, you want to document the incident response plan considering both the technical side as well as the business side. You want to build scenarios into the plan with potential steps to really how to mitigate those situations as well. Number two would be really to identify and build relationships with the key stakeholders that are going to be part of the incident response. So who to include from the business side, the legal side, audit, corporate communications, as well as IT, obviously, and who's actually going to be participating in this incident. And this essentially will form really your incident response team. Number three would probably be really socializing the plan with key stakeholders. And that's why it's a very important step, actually. And this can be done, you know, from my experience, you can do it through a tabletop exercise. You can do this yourself or use a third party. I personally would highly recommend, if it's the first time you're doing it, to use a third party. They're experienced, they're able to build out the scenarios for you to test out. You know, you want to walk through this few scenarios, identify if each of the participants really understand what their roles and responsibilities are during an incident. And then a few other quick points in terms of recommendations. Number four would probably be making sure you've got external relationships established with incident response firms, either a $0 retainer or potentially a paid retainer, so that you can quickly engage an external firm if necessary, rather than having to deal with it during the incident. You also want to establish relationships with key law enforcement as well, if necessary. And then finally, you know, post an incident occurring, you want to make sure that your plan is kept up to date. Any sort of lessons learned from the incident are updated within the plan as well.
Sure. Thank you. Michael, what's your take on this?
Oh boy, so I'm writing myself a note here to hire Zaki as a sponsor, spokesperson for my breachthekeep.com.
Happy to.
Yeah, he's bang on. He's nailed every single aspect of this. Is make sure that you've got your communications plan, and this isn't a we should thing. In Canada, as of November 2018, the Canadian government, the Office of the Privacy Officer, has mandated that a company must have a breach response plan and communications templates developed. Not having that plan in place and having a breach happen could result in financial penalties as well. So you know, having the plan in place, having communications templates, having your incident response team well known, And the incident response team, as Zaki said, there's two sides to it. There's the decision makers, your corporate side that have the ability at a moment's notice to make a financial decision on how we're going to move forward for this breach. And then there's the operations team, the actual, the busy bees, the doers that are actually going to identify the threats, put together a mitigation plan and a recovery plan. And then there's a channel of communications and authority between those two teams.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think as part of the updates to the new PEPIDA back in 2018, they also talk about mandatory breach reporting too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they have to report that within 48 hours to the privacy office. So that should all be part of the plan. So Brian, what's your take on this? What's your perspective on the importance of incident response?
Well, I think test. I think that's probably, a lot of organizations that I see have the proper documentation in place and the procedures, but they never test it. For whatever reason that is, could be just organizationally, they just don't have the time. They brought in maybe somebody like Michael to put it all together, and he did an awesome job, but they don't test it. Whether it's quarterly, to me, I think that's the biggest thing, because when it comes down to it, and when the poo-poo hits the fan, if you can have all the documentation in the world, but one, if it's not updated, if it's not tested to make sure that it works for your organization, you're going to be in more trouble, I think, than you are with. That's probably the only thing I would add.
The two key deliverables from a breach to keep engagement is the team building, making sure that your CSIRT team is able to communicate with each other, and learning how to problem solve in a moment of chaos. So yes, you've got your playbooks. Absolutely, you've got your playbooks, but things might be different than your playbooks were written. So understanding how to do problem solving on the fly and manage that communication.
And that's a good segue into my next question, which is about COVID-19 based threats. So did people have the COVID-19 playbook in place? Were they prepared for COVID-19? And of course, towards the onset of today's session, Yaron made a really good point. We need to have playbooks. And of course, not just have those playbooks, update them. Because remember, I always tell people that your framework and your documentations and your use cases should evolve at the same pace as the threat landscape is evolving, because the threat landscape is changing every day. I mean, we see the state actors coming up with something new and all these things. So our organizations working towards updating their playbooks, because I mean, Brian made a really good point. Test, and test. I mean, your instant response plan is as good as a piece of paper if you don't test it.
Right.
That's it. I mean, yeah.
One of the things that we've noticed with the COVID-19 is VPN access. So every company jumped up and magnified their VPN access by an order of 2 to 10. And they've all created, and I'm going to say 90% of them, pulling the number out of the air, have created generic profiles that will allow everything on my laptop to gain access to everything inside the company, because it was convenient and quick. Yeah.
Yaron, good point. Yeah. Yaron?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that playbooks are important. Another key thing that is critical, and usually it's not looked at until the critical moment, is the the terms, the wording that you have in your runbook, because that will determine when the clock of the incident started. So if you started the incident, you have suspicious activity, for instance, you don't pull the plug and say, we have an incident, because then the GDPR clock starts now, and you don't know anything about it. So you need to train the team to be very careful when they identify any suspicious activity, not to pull these terms, because if there is an investigation and all these communications are now being looked by a third-party auditor, you might be in the hotspot that you didn't inform GDPR or other regulations as per the time period that you were supposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to bring in Zaki now. So, I mean, we're into week number 12 since the lockdown, and since we've all embraced pandemic as a reality. What are the key threats that we see now pertaining to organizations, of course, which can lead to a breach? We're talking about the current scenario.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, with this whole COVID-19 scenario, I mean, number one, it was a great opportunity to test our BCP plans, to identify, you know, if there's been any weaknesses in them, and then really from what we're seeing, and actually I was on a call a couple of days ago with one of the CISO from RBC as well, and generally we haven't found a significant uptick in terms of increased phishing or increased threats hitting us. Yes, there's definitely phishing hitting our organizations from a COVID perspective, you know, seeking donations or giving false information and such. But fortunately, our tools and technologies and, you know, the effort we've been putting into our people to train them have really helped us through this crisis from a security perspective specifically. So, I mean, we're highly, you know, we're on alert. More hypersensitive to threats hitting. You know, our SOC is very much alert. We're being very vigilant. Fortunately, we haven't seen the kinds of threats you would expect, like an increase. And I mean, that's a testament to definitely the technologies companies have rolled out, we've rolled out, and the kinds of processes we have in place, as well as, you know, our people as well, that they're well aware of how to handle situations.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to bring in the perspective of the research and education space and healthcare, because that's the space that we operate in as an organization. So I think I did a session on cyber terrorism yesterday, and I did mention that the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity has raised the threat level of the healthcare organizations and the research organizations in Canada. And the reason for that is that the cure for COVID-19 is worth billions of dollars on dark web right now. Lots of state actors, lots of non-state actors who are after it right now, and guess who the target is? It's the hospitals. And of course, I think some of the initial attacks that we saw in North America were targeted towards the testing centers. So people are not just after the research information around COVID-19, but they're also after the data. Right? And testing centers are victims, research hospitals are victims, universities are victims. And I think one of the things that Microsoft did published a whole big advisory on backdoors to VPNs. So what has happened is that most of these cyber criminals are now exploiting backdoors on VPN softwares, which are being used by hospitals.
Yeah.
Yeah. All that. Other thing that I also want to mention is that one of the universities that I work that is in Southern Ontario, is one of the most large universities. They experienced a breach, and of course that was through non-standard ports for RDP, because for universities, most of the researchers, they were locked out of their offices, and of course the only way for them to access their desktop was to RDP. And of course, most of these institutions.
There you are, Fer.
Sorry.
He's back.
You got so excited.
Yeah, so most of the hospitals who are experiencing I'm sorry, I was talking about the university. I got distracted. So the university, what happened with them was that that most of the researchers, they were accessing RDP without VPN and on non-standard ports. And what happened in their case was
Identified.
I'm sorry, somebody is calling me. Let me just. Yeah, you were right. I could have turned off my phone. Michael Ball. I'm so sorry about this. I don't know why people are calling me right now. But anyway, yeah. So what happened was that one of the admin accounts was brute forced. So brute force is on the go, and of course, with the higher education sector right now, not all of them have got multi-factor authentication. And that's just one instance I've quoted you. There's so many instances in which higher education and healthcare institutions are falling victims to these attacks. And of course, I don't even want to talk about phishing right now because phishing is another discussion. There has been a 600% increase in phishing attacks, and of course, I think that's the only attack vector which is the most successful one, which has the most success rate right now.
Yeah, Zaki, I just want to say that many of these organizations before, they've been exposed months and months ago. The backdoors are now being utilized. So it's not that it's a new breach. It's mainly now somebody is utilizing the backdoors.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense.
That's a great point. Anyway, so I think I have some questions coming up on the question window. So let's move on to the questions now, but some really good points, guys. Thank you. So the first question that I have is that should a company ever consider putting geographical barriers on their website/resources if only servicing a small demographic and want to prevent a data breach or even infringement from individuals in other countries? Wow, that's a good question. Who wants to take this one?
So it's a business risk statement more than a security statement.
Yeah.
Right, so from a business risk perspective, what is the value of placing those restrictions versus the value of missing that additional client space?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and blocking regions will not matter because the attackers are utilizing all sorts of infrastructures across the world, so
like a VPN?
they can tailor the attack.
Yeah, anonymized.
Exactly. Yeah, VPN or spoofing the
So
IP.
it's not really effective.
Yeah.
Maybe invest in WAF solution. It's a better option.
Good point. And I think if a state actor or a non-state actor is attacking you, they will use an IP address of your country. Right? Somebody next door.
Very true.
They actually will use an internal IP that you have right away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question that I have is that exactly why is it difficult to move from cloud providers? Surely you're not bound for life. Okay. I hope that's not a comment, that's a question. Brian, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I don't think you're burned for life. It's just the difficulty. You probably went through a lot of effort to move there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
One, there's probably a political or there's probably a personal risk of moving back, to kind of say you gave up. I think the other one is that you may have the contractual obligations that you've gotten into that you have to fulfill. And, Azure, AWS have these, you have to have a certain utilization while you're in there, or there's penalties, right? So it could be one of those. There's obviously technical reasons why, external DNS, IPs, that type of stuff. But yeah.
Even topology and tooling between the cloud providers is different.
And the cost of, usually the upload cost is free of charge. The download cost is quite cumbersome when you are hoarding terabytes upon terabytes.
Okay, just want to do a time check. The time is 2:03 p.m. Zuhair, do we have any more questions?
No, you guys have covered pretty much all the questions that came in from our wonderful audience here.
Okay, so I just want to be cognizant of time because I know there's another session happening after this one. I think I would just like to, just the one last thing, any concluding remarks would be good. Just 10 to 20 second concluding remark by everybody. Brian, what do you have to say? A recommendation to people, key lessons learned from your side.
Yeah, I think to me, a recommendation, is, get out there and look at the standards that you need to adhere to as part of your organizations, like NIST, and so forth. That's what I would state. Understand them like Michael and Zaki had brought up the government regulations that you'd have to adhere to around your breach. And if it happens.
Good point. Zaki, what is one recommendation that you give everybody? One tip.
Yeah, I think really everyone should really be focusing on the basics of information security, you know, doing your patching well, vulnerability management well, access management well. If you do those things, that'll be a significant part of preventing breaches from happening. Focus on the shiny tools a little bit later on once you've matured.
Good point, really good point. Michael, thank you, Zaki. Michael Ball.
So I just want to bring up a Venn diagram in your mind, okay? So we always relied on perimeter. Today, we're somewhere around 64% of employees have access to your crown jewels from outside your corporate network.
Mm-hmm.
And same 64% of corporate data now resides in the cloud. So if you do the Venn diagram of the number of people have access to the amount of data that is not inside your perimeter, much of that defense in depth that you've built is not even touched anymore.
Good point. Good point. Excellent. Jaron.
Yeah, well, I'll be the last one, and I shall say, I think that organizations, before they drill in, they need to zoom out and look exactly where they're sitting from their posture, the business perspective, understanding the threats and the landscapes, and any other areas before they drill into all these shiny tools, vendors, etc. So more situational awareness, understand where you are, what are the boundaries.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, guys. And I think what I'm hearing from everybody is that get your basics right. Have the basic baseline in place, have your security hygiene in place, define a baseline, stick to that, and then move towards adding other layers over it. With that, I would like to thank everybody on the panel today. We had some really good discussions, sharing a really good discussion. Thanks a lot for sharing some really good recommendations. So I would like to thank you all. Brian, Zaki, Michael, Yoran, you guys were really good. And Zuhair, thank you all. Thank you for managing this session. Thank you all who attended this session. A good afternoon to everybody.